3 more outs to get a 1-game lead on the Mets. No, we are here to talk about Georgia losing currently to Missouri late in this game and all the other fun, good stuff.
I have to stop you. I think Aaron Judge is stepping up to the plate.
Oh, my goodness. That's been a thing this week, hasn't it, y'all? Let us know in the comments if we're sounding good, if we're looking good. We are good to go. Josh, I just want to kick this thing off with what's going on with Georgia. I mean, we noted in our top 10s last week, you said it best, that Alabama and Ohio State were closing the gap. And at some point, like, look, Samford game, that was, that's the coach that got him his start. He wasn't going to crush him. But we really had some questions with the Kent State game. Okay, there's a lot of turnovers. It was a little weird. You still won by 17. But this, Josh, is kind of inexcusable because Missouri is an objectively bad team. What in the world is going on?
Well, the simplest answer, on one hand, is that Stetson Bennett is not playing well. He's overthrowing guys a lot, and he's missing passes. He seems a little bit rattled. He just isn't always the same player, I think, when they get pressure on him. And I think Missouri is doing certain things to give him difficulties. Bennett, like Young, is short. And when you have a player that's short at quarterback, you can bring pressure up the middle, and it can kind of cause problems. And I think what Missouri's kind of done defensively is to work around that, where they're not giving him easy throwing lanes, but trying to make him throw over their guys. So you can bring a lot of interior pressure and then just make sure you don't let him have a flat, even throw on the sides. And when he throws up and over, I've talked about this for a few years, his accuracy is not great. I mean, if he can, I know he hits deep bombs and people are going to say that, but it's sort of a float the ball downfield thing. And there are certain quarterbacks that are usually more athletic throwers where they can drive the ball straight or they can float it up. But the range between those two, when you're trying to throw it with some velocity over coverage, they don't have it. I think Stetson Bennett does have that problem, and Missouri's found some issues with it. That's the biggest thing, right? 30 attempts in the game, 195 yards passing. They're throwing for about 6 yards per attempt. And this is a guy that was throwing for crazy numbers at the beginning of the year. And that's the running game is also not really contributing anything, but without the ability to pass, it's kind of killing it. And then defensively, I mean, they're just not playing great, and they're playing pretty well. I mean, Missouri has at the moment 63 yards rushing, 180 yards passing. I mean, about 250 yards. They're not getting a lot, but the offense is generating so little that it's enough for Georgia to be in this position. So I don't know a whole lot more to say beyond that. I will say that injury to Jalen Carter was just a dirty play.
Yeah,
but those things have kind of piled up, and it's kind of getting away from them.
Yeah, and look, I do think there's plenty of time in this game. We've got Georgia fans freaking out in the chat, and I get it. Like, this is where Alabama fans were in their Texas opener about right now, right? Like 19-9 and Georgia's driving. There's time for Georgia. I think Georgia probably does pull this out, but we'll see, later in this show. But Josh, the thing for me that is the main takeaway here, regardless of final score, is that really there is no front runner. Really, that we are at a complete reset in week 5 on who's the best team in college football, who is like we're not penciling in anybody for that championship game. And that's pretty awesome because we haven't really been in that position for a long time, including last year. That was a pretty crazy year, Renaissance season and all that. We still had a feeling about a couple of teams at this point in the season. And I don't think we have that, other than we know that, the top handful of teams are great and there's a huge gap probably between the rest. But isn't that kind of where we're at right now?
I think so. I feel like things are more open. There's a lot of reasons for it. I think defensively teams have caught a lot to what's going on with the RPO. I think quarterback play is not as great this year as it's been in the past few. That's not to say that there aren't great quarterbacks out there like CJ Stroud or Bryce Young when he's healthy. But in the past few years, we've had a lot of years with maybe 5 first-round draft picks at quarterback and a lot of guys that are top 3-round quarterbacks. I don't think there are that many this year, and it's kind of a quarterback-driven sport, so it really holds things back, and it really prevents some of these top teams from pulling away because I don't know that they have as much of an advantage as they've had previously. And when you have better defensive play, the margins in the game shrink, right? When teams have the ability to leverage their talent more, then they can run away with the score, which means the talent differential is such a bigger deal. But it does feel like it's wide open. I still think really those three teams are ahead of everybody: Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State. But maybe not as much as we thought. Maybe there's reasons to think that maybe Georgia and Alabama can be beat, or Alabama's injury situation is going to be a problem. But Ohio State, for this whole discussion, didn't do anything to deserve this sort of disparaging remarks. I mean, they're kind of still sitting there pretty at this point. I mean, and that's, again, if you ignore Notre Dame at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, but that's the thing that I kind of like about all this is we got to ignore a game or two for all these teams. Alabama had their Texas game. I think what they did today was pretty impressive, if I'm being entirely honest. But if we're having to do this with Georgia, we're having to do this with Ohio State. Nobody is dominant like a 2012 Alabama or 2018 Alabama plus Clemson. Nobody is showing that they're running away with it, which makes this a whole lot of fun. Benjamin V with the super chat. Let's go ahead and get these rolling. Michigan's offense looks legit. Ironic because of the score, but more concerned about the defense, specifically the pass rush, though they woke up in the fourth quarter. And yeah, I mean, I noticed a little bit today wasn't so much that, 14 points is not a lot. But old Spencer P went for 246, almost 8 yards an attempt. But the Russian defense was there. They didn't run it a lot. Iowa didn't, but they did have some drives. They had some, they had something a little bit throughout the day that maybe gave you cause for concern. And I think that contributed to the lower score for Michigan, because Michigan wasn't getting the ball back quickly enough to really get a lot of play count in. But I didn't love the offense today. I think Iowa's got a good defense, but JJ McCarthy, again, not super effective. 155 yards, 6.5 per. I did like Blake Corum. And look, people might look at this box score and say, oh, 44.6 yards per carry, but he carried it 29 times. At some point, that's going to bring your average down. But in general, I still, Josh, don't love this Michigan offense. Now, having said that, I like both the offense and defense enough to feel like together it makes a good football team. But I'm not looking at this Michigan offense going, wow, man, these guys can get it.
Yeah, they just kind of slowly built a lead and pulled away from an Iowa team that doesn't have a very good offense. I was actually a little concerned by the fact that Iowa in the passing game had some success. Now you get why, because Michigan was totally sold out against the run because Petrus gonna Petrus. But I felt like this was a good performance from Michigan on both sides of the ball. I don't think very highly of Iowa, so it's hard for me to take a lot more than that. And McCarthy is the classic case of a quarterback that sort of bails out his own mistakes. What I mean by that, there's some plays where he's running around, scrambling, makes something happen, throws or runs for a first down that very subtly he really shouldn't be scrambling in the first place. And, sort of skipping ahead a little bit, and I don't know that we want to segue yet, but the Bryce Young injury situation is a good example of why that's a bad thing. That Bryce Young on third down, that clip that gets showed over and over again, it sticks out to me every time. He's rolling right against zone coverage, which means a linebacker is able to crash, and his check down running back release is open, clean, right when he leaves what was actually a clean pocket. And he's not going to have any contact if he just takes it down to his running back, and his running back's probably going to get the first down on that play. As a quarterback, a lot of times when you make really impressive plays, you're sometimes doing it because you didn't take the easy one that was right in front of you. That to me is a lot of what JJ McCarthy is right now. And I'm not sure how much they can or can't develop him to kind of get him past that point.
I'm muted, which is great. This software we have lets me know when I'm talking to myself. Darius Williams says, why was Arkansas the number one team in the country for one quarter? And this is probably a decent segue to discuss that game. Alabama was going to win that game 600-4 if they had enough time and Bryce Young stayed healthy. That third quarter was reflective of really them not being able to do much offensively, or them being Alabama. and that defense was gassed. I mean, it was absolutely gassed. And then they had the onside kick and the wildest just brain fart punt I've ever seen, or long snap. Josh, I think you said it didn't hit the up back, but it got really close. But it was like a cascading, just crazy string of events that really led to 26 points. And 10 of those were from special teams issues. I thought the defense played really well for Alabama today and kept Arkansas kind of at bay for those other 3 quarters. But what really kind of impressed me was the Alabama run game, and specifically the Alabama offensive line that's been really maligned for the last 2 years. Josh, if this Alabama O-line can get it, we might be seeing a far different Alabama team than we saw last year and then the first game or second game this year.
Yeah, and I'll give 2 comments to that. The first comment, the rally that Arkansas had offensively did also coincide with Brian Branch getting here for Alabama. That's probably kind of been playing himself into an All-American caliber nickel for them. And they put on a guy, Devonta Smith, not the same Devonta Smith, just really weird coincidence, that hadn't really played much, and they shifted another safety down. And I think their defense was kind of out of sorts due to that, and that's when Arkansas had success. So there were a lot of things compounding with a tired defense that had an injury. And the point there is that's what it took for Arkansas to score 16 points in 1 quarter. And then Alabama pulled away again in the 4th. Something we flagged in the preview, something I talked about on Twitter, and then I think it was, we kind of went back and forth with a couple people on this. Alabama probably had the most underrated passing game, or Alabama's run game was one of the most underrated aspects of any team in the country. Alabama went into this game leading the country in yards per carry, and they led the country in yards per carry by about a half yard, which is kind of crazy. And I don't know, and maybe people in the audience can pipe up on that, I don't know how many of you really realize that Alabama was number 1 in rush per play, and that they were number 1 in rush per play by a significant margin. And the more I looked on this and the more I started to see really how people were sort of handicapping this game from a modeling perspective, the more I realized, and we even tweeted about it, I thought Alabama would be able to win this game if they never threw a pass. And I actually tweeted the words, I think Alabama can probably win this game if they never throw a pass. I did not realize by tweeting that I was going to create some sort of cosmic series of events where that had to happen. But I do think it ended up being true, right? I mean, Alabama ran the ball in this game 42 times for 317 yards. They ran the ball 42 times for almost 8 yards a carry at 42 carries versus Arkansas. And I know, again, Arkansas's run defense is not great, and I don't know that they're even particularly good. It's hard to run again for 8 yards a carry against a P5 team, especially an SEC P5 team. And if Alabama can get that out of their run game, I mean, even if Bryce Young's banged up, maybe they drop a game in the next couple, depending on his injury situation and how all that goes. But still, that run game to complement their passing game as it comes around gives them a tremendous amount more stability than I think many of us had anticipated.
And Iceman in his super chat, thank you, Iceman, said, what are y'all's thoughts on the Alabama run game this week? Did they exceed expectations? Sorry for calling you guys UGA bootlickers. That was a joke. We get called everything bootlickers, so we're used to it. I was joking back with you. And yeah, the run game was interesting to me because they had to run. I think that Jalen Milroe is probably a better quarterback than he showed today. They had to run to really create some separation and had to have some wins in the run game to create separation. Now, some of the long runs were really bad run fits from Arkansas and just overselling, because they had to oversell to get to a point where they could stop the run. But that overselling also leaves you open to see what we saw, and that's 70-yard runs. I noticed in the first half that Milroe was going through his progressions. He had a couple of good throws or good reads. I don't think all of them were completed where it wasn't his first read. That was something that I didn't expect to see from him. So from that standpoint, I think it was pretty good. I do think that, like the underthrow to Burton was bad. There was some issues where Alabama couldn't catch the ball. But in general, I think he brings enough athleticism to the table that he can be game planned for with this offensive staff. And they probably do have a package for him that we didn't see today because I imagine they wanted to hold that package for in case he has to be the starter next week against A&M.
Yeah, I thought what they got out of him was pretty impressive for a redshirt freshman, and sort of for the level of athlete he is. I felt like his ability to command the offense was almost surprising. I don't know as a pure passer that he's that great, and I mean that from ability to throw the football like at a target. He's a little bit inaccurate or inconsistent, but I agree with you. There are things you can do with that level of athleticism that I don't think they showed. And I think they showed it the first drive. Maybe he was in the game where they ran him a lot more, and then they kind of broke it open maybe a little bit. But for the rest of it, it felt like they were playing around with their base offense. I imagine they had no interest in putting on tape whatever he's going to be any more than they have to, because they might have to play him for a game or two. And like we say a lot with guys like that, you get about 1 to 2 games of that tape, and then teams are going to know what it is, adjust to it, scheme the heck out of it, and they're going to largely shut it down. We saw that last year with Caleb Williams, and I think this could be a similar situation where Milroe could be pretty effective like Caleb Williams was for a game or two, and people may be really high on him. If they have to rely on him for 3, 4, 5 games, I think his effectiveness will drop off precipitously. Just because I imagine as a redshirt freshman, he's probably not that developed to the offense, at least nowhere near as close as Bryce Young probably is at the same point.
Stephen Light said, late to the stream, anyone else want to strangle the mouse for interrupting college football with the Yankee cross promotional propaganda? Yeah, we actually opened with a couple of jokes regarding that. It's been a nightmare. And you know, I'll just say one thing about this, Josh. Really, the frustrating thing, and I tweeted about it, in this day and age, when there's so many streaming opportunities, platforms, you can get anything on your device. You can see things live. You know what channel these things are on. If somebody wants to see that, they will find it. And so when you're breaking into the Houston football game on Thursday night for a league record, not a major league record, Major League Baseball record, it's just kind of insane to me. I can't believe that they were doing this. I can't really think of much that's similar to this in the recent past. Josh, this feels like, 2001 before we had all these options available to see all this content.
Well, it's hard for me to add a lot more to that opinion because I don't know what else there is to say. If I want to watch Aaron Judge, when I'm watching football, I have my Apple TV 4K up, and when I can with ESPN, and I'll have usually between 2 and 4 games on that. I'll have an iPad up that I borrow from my wife who's watching. Thank you, honey, for your birthday present and letting me borrow it on game day. And I have a game on that, which you have to do if you have Fox and CBS because you can't do split screen otherwise. And sometimes I'll even have a laptop or something open. If I want to watch Aaron Judge, I'll put it on one of those displays. We live in a century where I can have 5 different things going at once if I feel like it. You do not have to take away one of those games to where I can't watch it at all, so you can forcibly split screen Aaron Judge walk up. And I don't know. I'd love to see it in the comments. I will say this. I'm not sure if anybody's going to be brave enough to do it. If you actually want to see Aaron Judge, comment, and nobody else bully that person. I just want to know if that person actually exists. And they should get applause for coming out if they do. But I don't know that they do.
No,
I just can't figure out who this audience is. Like I just truly don't know how many college football fans care to have their college football interrupted over this. I don't understand the demographic at all.
And Josh, just noting, so Georgia's driving late against Missouri, and there was a dropped interception from a linebacker from Missouri on what was an incomplete pass. And I think that was reflective of what you just said earlier. I don't think he ever saw him. I don't think he was tight on the line. It wasn't a deep pocket. I don't think he ever saw over his offensive line to see that linebacker had dropped into coverage. And he was, especially if you're the kind of guy that locks onto a receiver, if you're short, you don't see that.
Yeah, he's not playing great. And we talked about early in the season, maybe he should get some, I think fairly should have gotten some consideration for Heisman. And now, they just had so we're sort of delayed, and you'll hear delay from us, but they just had to run up the gut and went for about 6 yards. But Missouri fired both linebackers at the snap. I mean, they 2 gap blitz. They ended up hitting the wrong gap, so the guy got about 6 yards. But they're doing that every time. It's sort of the anti-Alabama strategy some teams adopted last year, and they're trying the same thing, and it seems to be working. And it just, I don't know. Maybe he's off. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's a combination of a lot of things. But you're right. It's because Missouri scored, Georgia's in trouble. They got to score twice. 11 minutes is a lot of time. I think this game is at least 50-50 in who's going to win it. But they're certainly in a lot of trouble now. What, third and one? Not a great situation.
I also think this is a little reflective of an area where we've taken some heat, but I stand on it. I think we're right. They took a step back this year at running back, and their wide receivers are still not great. It's been a while now that they've not been great, be it for injury or whatever reason. They're not great tonight. Now, I love Washington, and I think that Bowers is amazing, but I think the thing that made this Georgia offense click last year a little bit was the threat of the run. Play action was crazy. But without elite talent around him, Stetson Bennett can look pedestrian.
Yeah, he can. And sort of to the point you're making right now, it's about to be 4th and 2 by my feed. Just, I know you guys are delayed, letting you know how we're watching it. They tried to run the ball, and their offensive line's not getting enough push, and Missouri's able to sell out so much they can get a stuff. The way Missouri's playing, I'm telling you, Georgia does have a lot of one opportunities all over the field, but the receiving core is not good enough to capitalize on them. So whereas, I noted on Twitter with that Alabama-Arkansas game early, Arkansas was selling out hard against the run because they couldn't really beat it organically. And when they did that, Alabama was able to hit some plays that really just slants, and they went for a touchdown because their guys would get 5 yards on them or just catch a slant and run past them. And then these big passing plays that made it 14-0. I don't think Georgia has that counter, and it creates a lot of problems. They were able to efficiently drive the field on teams all last year, but like you're saying, the run game's taken a little bit of a step back. The receivers aren't quite good enough, and it doesn't take much of a step back. If you're playing pure efficiency football, you've got to string together 4 or 5 first downs in a row. It's easy to not be able to do that, and then all of a sudden you end up in a situation where you're trailing the 4th quarter to Missouri.
I can't believe that they're going to score here. I can't believe that they went for it on 4th. Again, it was close. I actually think they missed a false start there. Look, in hindsight, it's good they got the touchdown or whatever, but man, points are at a premium for them tonight, and so that was a little wild. Guthrie Lee said, Josh, here's $5 for being brave enough to doubt PJ Fleck last week and for being right. And this is something that you've been on for a while. You're not super high on Captain Row the Boat. And look, I don't think Purdue's a great team. So the fact that they, lost to Purdue, but really offensively, they were bad, is a little concerning. But go ahead and take your victory lap on PJ Fleck.
Well, a victory lap's a tough thing, right? Like, I don't enjoy being down on people. Maybe I get more enjoyment out of it than I.
No, it's being correct. It's not necessarily PJ Fleck in particular, just being right about him.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of PJ Fleck on a couple of different levels, and I think he's good at motivating players within bounds, but they are always kind of disjointed as a football team. Their offensive identity is always a little bit questionable. I never quite know what they're trying to do, and I don't know that they do either. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. The biggest thing I had to say was New Mexico State, Western Illinois, Colorado, Michigan State. Those are all really bad teams. And there were a lot of people that were saying they're 4-0. Why aren't they getting more hype? They should be top 10. Those were really bad teams. And yeah, it was definitely kind of a gross overreaction, I think. And the Purdue game is a little more of a pull to reality. I don't know if that was a down game or who they are or what. But we've seen a lot of that, right? We tweeted earlier this week about there was sort of this silo with Wisconsin and Oregon, and I want to say it was Washington State, and all these teams exist. And people say transitive property isn't a real thing, and it's not, right? You don't want to say you beat this one team in a whole schedule, so they're, you're better than them and everybody else they played. But collectively, when you talk about groups of teams and groups of performances, yeah, that does matter because it's the only way you can evaluate someone. And sometimes what happens is early in the year, when there's 3 or 4 games that have been played and only maybe 2 or 3 have been meaningful, you get these round robins. I think South Carolina, Arkansas, Cincinnati were in one where none of them were really that good. And I think that was another bubble. And Minnesota kind of floated on the periphery of that and was undefeated. And they just, this is the first, truly, really the first legitimate opponent they faced, and they lost. So we'll see where they end up. But, it's a long, long, long way to go. We'll see. I'm watching by the way, I have a bunch of games up as much as I can handle, trying to keep it off the screen because I don't want to get demonetized. LSU and Auburn's pretty crazy. Like, there's a turnover punt and then immediate turnover, and then Auburn's trying to drive now down 4. Kind of a wild end of college football. I'm sure a lot of people are distracted, justifiably.
Yeah, and they had it was like a running back through an interception, which was kind of hilarious. Mike Farino had a couple of super chats, but one was about Aaron Judge. As a Yankees fan, the Judge thing is absolutely stupid and insane by ESPN. We agree. Mike also said, how's it going, y'all? No way Georgia doesn't fall to 3 after these 2 weeks, right? Even if they win. And, that's kind of what we were saying before. Like, we see that Georgia is mortal now, and it's not just a one-off. It's really 2 weeks in a row. I'm completely throwing out the Samford game because I think there's a lot of circumstance there where they didn't want to just run it up on his old coach and all that. But honestly, I'm going to have Georgia third tonight in my top 25. If Bryce Young's healthy, I don't think that Georgia beats them. And Ohio State's playing really good football. Now, I will say, like, what we saw today with Wisconsin, it doesn't, like, again, we don't go back and punish Ohio State for how we saw them after that game and how we see them now. Like, I'm probably going to move them up first, but it does give me pause in terms of, like, thinking their win against Wisconsin, like, we might have overreacted that a little bit in the way that we overreacted to maybe a little bit the Oregon win. And I don't want to rain on Ohio State fans' parade. Again, I've got them number 1, but I do think that just like Ohio State fans wanted proper context around Georgia all season, especially after last week, I think it's only fair, like, that we give it for the Wisconsin game that now doesn't look great and Rutgers is terrible. That doesn't mean Ohio State is bad in any way, but I think it's worth noting.
No, I agree. And look, as I said on Twitter earlier this week, I feel like I had a series of losses up to the beginning of the week and then did better at the end of it. Ohio State did everything an elite team should do playing a team like Wisconsin if they're bad. But I think you have to calibrate yourself into understanding that Wisconsin is a bad team. And beating Wisconsin badly is beating a bad team badly. It's not beating Wisconsin. I don't know. I think Wisconsin's going to struggle to make a bowl. I think that's how bad they are. And I'm not sure where the Big Ten as a whole is, but they're just not a good football team. But maybe this brings up, can we have a slide aside on this? Because we are at one of those points in one of those years where it is really easy to say this team's bad, that team's bad, this team's bad, that team's bad. Georgia's not who they should be. Missouri's terrible. Auburn's terrible. At what point is this just what a football team is? I mean, if Missouri and Auburn are both terrible football players, we're playing the worst team ever, and then Missouri has Georgia on the ropes the next week, if everybody sucks, nobody sucks, because sucking is average. And so I think sometimes we have a calibration problem where it's like, if we don't have 20 teams winning 80-0, then football is terrible nationally. Maybe football's just competitive this year, because you know what competitive football looks like is you have some teams upsetting other teams, and competitive football, may mean some teams like Wisconsin or Michigan State can lose to a lot of other teams. So I don't know. I've got a little bit of a problem with that, and I'm having a hard time parsing it because it's getting really easy to talk about why teams are flawed, why Oklahoma's a terrible team. We can talk about that later. But if you want to talk about that, then you got to tell me, who's necessarily clearly better and more consistent. And that question is getting really hard to answer.
Well, I think it's hard to answer down the line, but I think it's pretty clear that like Wisconsin's now, I think, lost 3 in a row. Maybe they won 1 after they lost to Washington State, but you don't get blown out by teams that have this little bit of talent, unless you've got problems, just systemic problems top to bottom. Um, and look, I think that a lot of teams can get sleepy and can turn things on, can turn things, can lose focus. We've seen that with Alabama in the past. But I do think in a couple of weeks, you're going to start to see tiers that might still be a little muddy. Like how much, like now Ole Miss is going to pass Kentucky in the rankings. I didn't feel great about Kentucky all year. I still don't think they're a very good team, but there's going to be pressure to put Ole Miss in the top 10. And this might be to your point more than anything is, we can say they're all good if that makes anybody feel any better. But the root of it all is there's a ton of parity in that. The old saying that people used to say about college football is any given Saturday, anybody can beat anybody. Throw out the record books and this and that. When in reality, that wasn't the case. This year, I feel like, except for maybe Alabama, Ohio State, and if Georgia pulls this out, maybe you throw Michigan in there. For most other teams, you can say that.
Yeah, I think that probably is true. As we said, the thing that's missing, I truly believe, is that second tier of college football. The teams that normally rank 5 through 9 that are a good 10 plus points better than everyone else. And something Josh Pate has pointed out a lot with their rating system, which our modeling is all about 2 teams in a given matchup. We don't really do power ratings for a variety of reasons, kind of due to how the model works in part. But he was saying, there's only a few points that separate number 4 from number 25. That's really unusual. Like, this is a very unusually competitive year. And I really do kind of think it's not so much that everybody's more competitive. I actually do think it's just that there's a second tier that's missing. The teams that are usually number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 that are playing at a high level of football, but not an elite level of football. I don't know who those teams are, and I'm not sure they do exist. I think the team, what you're seeing is teams that are the quality of the normal third tier are just everybody. And there's not really anyone who separates. Now, we'll probably don't underestimate how much that can change in 6 weeks when we're talking mid to late November. But right now, I think that's where we're at. And you're on mute again, I think. Daniel's always talking to himself. Even when he talks to you, he's really talking to himself.
I have
it's hard for him to tell.
I have all these children running around the house, so I try to keep that noise off the broadcast. So I'm pretty quick with the mute button. To me, every team this year that's not Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State feels a little bit like every decent Kentucky team over the last decade. They could beat a good team 17-13, or they could lose 37-12. Like, I kind of love it, Josh. Like, I know that Georgia fans right now are like, this is hell, and I hate it here. But for the health of the sport and in general, giving fans the feeling of excitement, like right now in Columbia, Missouri, like there's a lot of people having a lot of fun that in most years would have shown up for a 37-10 beatdown. So I like it from that parity standpoint. I really like it. A couple more super chats we need to hit up. Nick said, at first, I didn't like you guys. Clap back in the comments. But over the years, I've come to appreciate your analysis more than anyone else. You guys bring the facts without all the other BS. Keep it up. And look, the thing about people jumping on us in the comments is we'll wade in the comments with you. We're sort of sympathetic, Josh, to the fact that we are by nature kind of negative because we are nerds and we do look at stats and we're trying to pick you apart. And that's abrasive to a lot of fans. And a lot of fans take it as hate. But if they hang with us like Nick did, they'll realize that we do that to everybody. And it's not anything to be taken personal. It's just how we analyze the game. We're just trying to find your weak spots because your local radio show or your home team podcast is just going to kiss your butt. And we're going to give you the whole picture.
Yeah, and I mean, it's tough. I mean, I really appreciate those comments because we try really hard to be as honest as possible, and sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. I think sometimes people want us to take more of an L or eat crow when we make a prediction and we're wrong, maybe when we're wrong by a lot. And we don't, because whatever our logic was for it didn't end up being wrong. You know, maybe we thought somebody was going to have a really effective passing game and the quarterback gets hurt. You know, I'm not going to take an L on that, but there's also a lot more subtle examples of things that go crazy, maybe turnovers or fumbles. And I think people have to sort of stick with this for a while to see that, yeah, you know, there was a good example a few years ago where we weren't really high on Miami and then they destroyed Notre Dame. And all the Miami fans were like, look, see, you've been wrong all along. And then Miami kind of imploded later. And it's just, you know, it's football. Sometimes we're going to be wrong because the team plays up and plays down. And look, we'll own we got the prediction wrong. But just because I'm wrong in the prediction and I own that I'm wrong in the prediction doesn't mean I'm going to take an L about the team or the performance or my projections long term. Because my experience, you can be proven wrong one week and then be proven right the rest of the year very, very often. But the thing I really want to hit home is I am always trying to be as correct as possible. Whether or not I am is a different question, but that is always my goal. And I always try to be as honest as possible where my mind is, even if I'm wrong with something. So it does mean a lot when you get those comments.
Quasar0121, 2 weeks in a row with a super chat, said, am I being pessimistic, or does anyone else think that with a loss to Missouri, Georgia could be the first 2-loss CFP contender if they lose to Bama? Look, that question it's possible. It's something to think about. But the committee has been pretty straightforward in saying that they don't love 2-loss teams in the playoffs. I think that you have a lot better shot of being in the playoffs as a 2-loss team if you were a conference champion. Georgia's not got the schedule, in my opinion, to lose to a bad team in Missouri and then lose to the only elite team they're going to play all year. That's tough for me. But what you always say, Josh, I'll let you kind of take the rest of this, is that question isn't asking the whole thing. And that is, it depends on what everybody else does.
Yeah, people talk about controlling your own destiny, and it's pretty simple. If Georgia is a 2-loss non-champion, it's not really about weighting Georgia. It's about what the other options are. If there are 4 1-loss champions out there, Georgia will not get in. If there is a 2-loss champion out there, Georgia has a shot. And that's all it comes down to. And, you know, as we're saying this, on my feed, Georgia's on the 1-yard line. So,
right.
You know, these things have a tendency to sort themselves out. And I was going to say a minute ago when they were down 10 at the start of the fourth quarter, I thought it was probably a 60% chance Georgia wins this game. You know, they still might lose, but I think they just took the lead on our feed. So they probably will win. So a lot of these discussions are just really premature. And if you can't even map out what's going to happen in this Georgia game, you can't even start to answer the question that depends on what everybody else in college football does. So you just kind of have to throw your hands up and say, well, you know, your chances are diminished. That's about all you know.
Mike Farino also said it's fair. We Ohio State fans were questioning Wisconsin on the message boards earlier. And I think that it goes back to the thing that you touched on, Josh, and that we have always said, and you said it earlier. Really, all you can learn is things that are concerning in those games. Like, the only thing that could come out of that game is either you handle your business, which is good. It's not your fault that Wisconsin sucks. Or you struggle with them like Georgia did with Kent State last week, and you still get the win, but you give us information to let us know that you're not untouchable. The difference between this Wisconsin game and the 2014 Wisconsin game, where they just went absolute ham in the Big Ten championship game, is that was a good Wisconsin team. So we got the information of the beatdown plus the fact that you're able to beat a good team that bad and create that level of separation. That's the thing we don't know about anybody in college football yet this year. We haven't seen, like, Alabama, if they were healthy, probably could have beaten Arkansas with the model score. I think the model was 51-12. They could have done that today, and we still wouldn't feel or have the information that we had when Ohio State beat Wisconsin in 2014 the way they did. So, look, I don't think there's anything negative to take away from Wisconsin being a bad team. I just think that you can't puff your chest and say, look how bad we beat Wisconsin, because other teams even bad teams seem to be able to beat them that bad. Georgia, Josh, we haven't talked about this much. And Iceman did come through with a super chat, and I'd like for you to talk about it. Talk about Ole Miss, Kentucky. You and I were trading texts all day on this game while it was going on. I was actually at a 5-year-old soccer game, watching it on my phone. But Josh, talk about this a little bit, kind of what you saw. Did it go how you expected? We didn't do this game, but I think you would have picked Ole Miss to win it if you had to pick.
Probably by a small margin, which is about what it ended up being. This was our 4th video. As you guys know, this isn't our day job, and so we kind of have to ration our time and how much we can record. The tweet that I sent out was that Will Levis is better than Jackson Dart. Ole Miss's skill talent is maybe that much more better than Kentucky's. And I think that's sort of an accurate depiction of it. Ole Miss is better defensively than they have been. They get better a little bit every year. There's a clear relationship somehow between these teams with how good your offense is and how good your defense is. It seems like they can't be the offensive juggernaut they were a few years ago and still be a good defense. It has to have something to do with the way the teams practice. I figure it has something to do with tempo and about running clean. I really believe it's about running clean reps offensively to get your offense really good, but that also doesn't teach your defense to tackle or take angles. That's my personal take, knowing how little practice time they're actually allowed to have. There were a few things that surprised me. The first was I thought Rodriguez was pretty effective, but in general, Kentucky's run game, which hasn't been good to this point in the year, still wasn't good. I mean, they didn't average, we're under 3 yards a carry, and that was really the fatal part of the game. Will Levis played well. He continues to be the player that I have seen from him, which is someone that doesn't necessarily, I think, read the field that great. He moves around well, does some great things in terms of improvising. He can make all the throws. He's not super consistent. He doesn't always see the easy play. He's a guy that's going to get drafted. He's not. I don't see the top 5. I know we were talking back and forth on it. The top 5 overall pick height for Will Levis, I just don't get it. I don't see that. I see a guy that could go in the 2nd or 3rd round. I don't see top 5, top 10 pick. I don't see him ahead of CJ Stroud or Bryce Young. I just don't see it. And that was not enough to carry the day when Ole Miss, and I thought Dart played well, but not great. I mean, he's a capable passer that has a lot of flaws in his own game developmentally. The big story of that game really was that Ole Miss's rushing attack was pretty dominant at times. They kind of moved the ball, whenever they needed to, ran for over 4 yards a carry, and most of their backs were 5 yards a carry or more. And that kind of that was the momentum I felt like that kind of overwhelmed Kentucky. And when I talk about skill players, Rodriguez, Cavassier, Smoke, Cummings are good backs, but you know what? Zach Evans is a good back. Judkins is a really good back. And even Dart ran the ball pretty well at times. And I felt like it overwhelmed Kentucky. I think Kentucky is a good team. I think they're a top 25 team. I don't think I had them in my top 10 last week. I'm going to sort of scroll and double check that. I know I did. I had them 9th. Yeah. Well, but I guess I had them there sort of by default. And I think I said that at the time. I don't think they're really a top 10 talent team. And I think Ole Miss probably was always better. They just hadn't played anyone that established that yet. So that's a long version of it for a super chat, but that's sort of my takes on
it. Making sure I'm not on mute. Underhill Julian said, with the bad injuries today, especially with LSU and OU games with players leaving on a stretcher, how do you think we can fix targeting and make the game safe, or can we? Is it just part of the game? Josh, I think they've done all they can, or maybe not. I think that maybe it's some equipment related. I think the targeting penalty has gone a little bit too far in terms of there's some assumed risk, in my opinion, that you take when you get out on that field, and there's still going to be hits like this because you're still talking about players who are running 100 miles an hour, having to make split-second decisions, and things happen. And even in the like, it was a bad hit. The Gabriel hit was bad, but like you're running full out, full sprint as fast as you can go, and you got to get this guy who's broke out in the open field with a long run, and he slides, and you're already going full speed. Like, I'm not saying that was a clean hit. I don't think it was, but I'm saying some of that's just going to happen. Isn't that kind of where we're at? Like there, we can't legislate and implement rules our way out of having some injuries still in the game.
I think that's the reality of it. I mean, if you talk any sort of analytics, you often end up in the idea of clustering. Events tend to happen together. And just because you have 2 in a day doesn't mean we have some massive new problem emerging. This just happens to be the day where we had a couple of those happen. And it's tragic and it's sad. It is a little bit the reality of the sport. The truth is we've got, 50, 60 college football games going, and you do that for week after week. We've played hundreds of games this year. You're going to have some injuries, and you're going to have some serious injuries. If you have that many games in soccer or a lot of other sports, you're also going to have injuries. You're way more likely to get injured skiing than playing football. So I think it's sad, but at some level, this is a contact sport. Any sport with this level of athlete is going to have some serious injuries at a good clip. And I feel like we've pared it down enough to where it seems like a shock when it happens. And I think people forget stuff like this, or stuff, people getting really, really hurt, or neck injuries. There was a time when it wasn't that uncommon. Concussions were really frequent. A concussion in a game, somebody getting their bell rung was common. And we've gotten it to the point where it seems rare and surprising when it happens, and it's sad, but at least I think I'm glad that we've gotten it to that point.
Killtech9 said, it was great seeing the running game take over in the Bama win. Probably missed y'all's breakdown. Great to hear y'all's opinion on what's going on with Georgia, about to drive back from a wedding. Yeah, we've touched on both of these games pretty heavily, but
wait. About to drive back from a wedding.
Yeah, that's you picked up a good detail, but we're not going to be too rough on him since he's listening to our show, but hopefully it wasn't his wedding. And he's just being a good friend, but we are disappointed in whomever decided to do that. So
no, I hope it is. I hope he just got married and he's like, you know what, honey, I gave you the day, but I got to tune into College Football Nerds. I mean, I know we're going back to the hotel room, but you got to give me 90 minutes.
Yeah.
Got to give me 90 minutes.
That would be pretty good. Yeah, we and Mike also said, let's give Kansas some love, 5-0, which is pretty shocking. I'm not, because I don't think either one of us got 10. They're 5-0, and they're a great, fun story. I don't think they're a great team. I think they won 14-11 today. But I think they're a good team, which is saying so much for Kansas. But that was an interesting aside. But yeah, Josh, on the Bama stuff, like the run game was there. You flagged it on Twitter going into the game. And then during the game, you talked about how Arkansas had to sell out to stop the run. And that really bit them in the passing game early because they were walking safeties up. That bit them there. And then it really hurt in the run game because you've got one level of defense. You're basically playing Madden punt block every running play. And if you don't get them at the line for a loss, then they're going to bust it home. And they've got, talented running backs. I was a little concerned, speaking of injuries, when I saw Jason McClellan, kind of compress his head and neck area. And then we did see a concussion from Branch. So did we hear anything? Did you hear on Bryce Young and his injury update?
So what I've heard, yeah, but it's just from the message board rumor mills and whatnot. I was Googling it. It sounds like it's an AC sprain, so like a clavicle sprain. I forget, there's somebody else that had that just recently. Drawing a blank. But there's another quarterback that had that recently. Sounds like it was relatively minor. My big thing is he came back out in pads on the sideline with his helmet without a sling, which told me that he probably was able to play if they wanted him to go in, and that seems to be the rumor. There's no way he would have been in pads if he was absolutely ruled out. So if he was able to go in that game, it can't be that serious. The question is going to be whether or not, because it is, I think, to his throwing shoulder, probably not whether or not he's going to be too injured to play again. Certainly going to play again this season. It's going to be how much does it affect his ability to throw the football, and how long does it take for him to come back. Saban in his remarks actually said that this is not the first time this has happened with him, which I thought was really interesting comment. But normally he gets over it within a few days. So I guess this might actually be a recurring issue for Young. And he may well be back for this week's game against Texas A&M, which has lost a lot of its luster from where everyone expected it to be. But that's still a good defense, and they're still going to give Alabama their best game. So that's going to be an interesting one.
I actually thought that they had him on the sideline. They would have him, if he could do it, like have him either way, because that gives them two quarterbacks to prepare. Like they would probably know that he can't play or assume it and kind of prepare for Jalen Milroe. Another super chat that you can kind of talk on a little bit before we get into our top 10s, Josh. Sam Scheidegger, I hope I got your last name right. Why don't you guys use advanced stats like EPA? Is the answer just that they're kind of hard to find to get by the time we're doing our shows on Sunday night?
The biggest answer, yeah, we record Sunday night, and most of your advanced stats things that you guys look at are not processed by that point. So that's the biggest reason. And the second reason why we don't always use so many advanced stats is that they're kind of harder, I think, for people to understand sometimes. EPA is a good stat. It talks about how the value of each play relative to the position on the field and the scoring potential for each play. There's certain things that sort of factor into that, and its relative value in that, maybe a play that's a high EPA play, if you have success in the 20 on your 20 versus their 20, having success on their 20 is more important. But from a projection standpoint, is having more success on their 20 indicative that you're going to be more successful the next game? Or is it just random that it was, where on the field you had success and things like that? Also, on a lot of those advanced stats, EPA is really, really useful in terms of sort of an absolute comparison of quality, a little bit better than yard per attempt, yard per carry. But, it is also a non-opponent adjusted stat. It's a situationally adjusted stat, meaning it reflects better where you're at and what the impact of a play was, but it's not an opponent adjusted stat. And so when you take all that together, we've used yard per carry and yard per attempt because people generally understand what it means. People kind of understand the difference between 6 yards per attempt and 8 yards per attempt in a practical sense. What does it mean to throw for 8 yards every play? I don't think people understand what an EPA number means. Even if it's a better betting metric, which I think it is, I don't know that people understand it as well. And then the availability problems and trying to talk through, the biasing issues and how you interpret it usually leads to us not trying to get into those stats too much. I'll segue real quick as I almost said this earlier, and I regret not having said it, that in Missouri's down 4 and they punted with 2 minutes left and Georgia had 3 timeouts they had 3 timeouts. And I was about to say, I honestly think it's a mistake because in that situation, it's 4th and 10. Yes. But if you don't get the ball back, you lose. If they get the ball back and get a first down, you lose. So you might as well go for it on 4th and 10. And if you don't get it, yeah, maybe they're close to field goal range or something. But if they get a field goal, it's going to be a 7-point game. But if they get 2 first downs, you're going to lose either way. So field position is not actually that important. And good chance they're never going to get the ball back. So
yeah.
That was actually, in my opinion, a pretty bad coaching error on Drinkwitz' part. They should have gone for it on 4th down. Absent horrific yardage, and 4th and 10 wasn't horrific. They should have gone for it on that down.
They also had plenty of time, and they completely got out of their offense and started running low percentage, really vertical passing plays instead of trying to just get a first down. And that's what you need is just to get a first down, and they never got it.
And I don't understand it if they can stopping Georgia cold, but they cannot stop Georgia this quarter. Georgia is running the ball down their throat and has for a couple possessions now. I don't understand why you expect if you give the ball back that you're going to get a stop in 3 or 4 plays. I mean, you're much more likely than not Georgia's going to get at least 1 first down. That was very, very poorly handled, which is why Missouri beating Georgia would have been such a shock because that's kind of who they are as a football team.
Yep. Yep, and they're not a good football team, and that's why my takeaway here is one, like I'm a little concerned for Georgia if I'm a Georgia fan in that stretch of games at the end of the year where they're not playing anybody elite, but they've got some decent teams all in a row. Cameron came through the super chat and said, "Got to win ugly sometimes, go Dogs." And that's what we said also earlier. Is like as long as you win, especially this year with everybody losing to everybody, you've still one, you control your own destiny, but two, you still have that breathing room to maybe lose a game and be last year's Alabama team where they lost and still make the playoffs. All right, Josh, I'm ready to take a stab at a top 10. We're trying to get these done a little quicker, maybe not go 2.5 hours like we've been doing, and just get it to 11:30 Eastern. So we need to bust out a top 10. I'm ready to do one if you are. And if you are, let me know. You can go first.
Sure. Do you want to do my top 10 all the way and then yours, or do you want to go 1, 2,
Yeah.
1, 2? We've done it a
No,
couple
yeah.
different ways.
Yeah, go ahead and just do your whole thing.
Okay. So this time, I think I have all the teams' records right, which I got wrong in my head as we were doing this live last week. My top 10 starts with Ohio State. Ohio State played very well today. They continue to perform at a high level. CJ Stroud did not have his best day. Quietly, Ohio State dominated that game on the ground. I don't think Rutgers is a great football team. They're improving, but they're still a bad football team. But right now, Ohio State is playing well defensively, very well defensively. They're playing well offensively. When the passing game hasn't worked, the run game stepped up a little bit, vice versa, really, since game one. They are playing like the most complete team in the country, I think, with the exception of my number 2, Alabama, who is right on their heels. Alabama without Bryce Young is probably a decent notch worse than Ohio State. I am not going to shift Alabama down right now for that. I don't like shifting someone down for an injury that just happened because I try to evaluate you more on your resume to this point. And if there's one thing we've talked about before that you can excuse, the unique thing is a loss without a quarterback or a bad performance without a quarterback or quarterback injury. It is probably the single most excusable thing in this sport. And the crazy thing to me is despite Bryce Young being hurt, they dominated a top 25 Arkansas team. I never believed that Arkansas was a top 10 team, but they are good. And they are probably, I think, and Daniel, do you agree with me this? I think Arkansas is probably a better team than anyone Ohio State's played. True or false? Do you think, well, and you may be tied up right now, but I think Arkansas
that's fair.
probably beats Notre. I think they probably beat Notre Dame.
Yep.
And they dominated them. And if Bryce Young hadn't gone out, they probably win that game 50-10. So that was a very impressive performance. Looks like right now, I think this game's over. Georgia's going to pull it out 26-22. But for me, they're now number 3. Their early season dominance is still in the back of my mind. They could be sleepwalking right now. They're kind of feels like they're banged up a little ways. They're out of sorts. Now few performances in a row, really, where they've looked really sort of sleepwalking on offense. The defense is very good. The defense is not really that good. I mean, part of the reason this game was close is the defense was giving up yards the whole game. They are not what they were the past couple of years. They're a step or two back, like we talked about in the preseason. The offense is still very efficient, but when it is not in sync and they're not operating properly, they don't have a ton of explosiveness. So they have to be very efficient. I think Georgia keeps the number 3 spot for me because, I've seen some good from them and I think they can get back to it. They also keep the number 3 spot because I know what the rest of college football looks like, but they are sliding right now. They would not, I don't know that they would be much more than, they're certainly going to be an underdog to Alabama or Ohio State if they played today or played next week. And it might be more than a field goal. My number 4 team right now is Michigan. I'm with you. We had this whole discussion earlier. You should watch the live show if you're seeing this cut up part of the clip. Michigan is playing good football, but they're still playing kind of a janky version of it. McCarthy improvises a lot when he should be hitting an easy play. Defensively, they still play well, but they're not perfect, and there's some chinks in that armor. But they're a little more complete for me than my number 5, which is Clemson. Clemson, I should say. Clemson looks like they're going to pull out this game, which is actually going right now in the fourth quarter against NC State. They are playing a lot better offensively than they did last year. They look like a way more complete team on that side of the ball. Defensively, I know they're banged up. They're not great. And they weren't great before they got banged up. The back end of that defense is not fantastic. They are either going to get to the quarterback and disrupt, or they're going to get challenged. And I do think their potential is as high as anyone. They could easily be one of the top 3 or 4 teams. If the offense improves, I still think I'm still surprised they haven't tried more to get Klubin, the backup K. I'm just going to call him that right now because I can't say it. I feel like they haven't gotten more involved because DJU does miss a lot of routine plays that really hurts them. I saw that a lot in the first quarter. Still there, but I think they're still cut above. Trying to move through more quickly now. Number 6, Oklahoma State had a good win against Baylor, had a really kind of a statement win against Baylor. I talked before Baylor, that Baylor BYU, where Baylor was at, having lost a game. I don't really know where Baylor is. There was a lot of Twitter discussion about that this week, and all of us were having a hard time really placing them. We feel like there were a lot of analytic silos. BYU was in one of those. You get teams like Washington State or Wisconsin that all kind of played each other, and it turns out that maybe the whole group's not very good. But Oklahoma State is still playing well. They're winning their games. That's enough right now for me to put them in number 6. Tennessee is number 7. They're quietly playing very good football. They're offensively, they're very, very good. Their Heupel's offensive scheme is excellent. Hooker is playing outstanding at the quarterback position. They have a good run game. I hate their defense. Their defense has not been good. I think their defense could get exposed, and I think their defense is probably going to cause them to lose multiple games. But we'll see that when it happens. The same, I could say, could be true of USC. Their offense is a little janky. I think Caleb Williams can show up or not show up depending on the day. Their defense is pretty suspect, but they seem like they're a lot better overall in terms of talent than the rest of the Pac-12. I have an expectation they're probably going to keep winning. I feel like they're probably going to drop a game inevitably. Maybe they drop 2. But I think offensively, if nothing else, they seem like they've got their stuff together where a lot of teams don't. My number 9 is Ole Miss, coming off their win with Kentucky. Their schedule has been weak enough to this point that they are difficult to evaluate. I will tell you a team that is not on my top 10 is Kansas, and it's because they're in the same boat. Kansas's schedule is very, very weak. Most teams with Kansas, I say most teams, there are a lot of teams with Kansas's schedule that would be undefeated right now. I am really happy for them. I'm excited for Kansas, but just being undefeated in and of itself does not make my top 10 based off performance, based on schedule. The team that struggles with Duke is a little bit different than a team in Ole Miss that struggle wins against Kentucky, who's a much higher caliber team. That was a very big win for them against another undefeated. And then my number 10, and everybody take a pause, is Penn State. It's been a long time since Penn State was in my top 10. There are a lot of people that feel like I hate Penn State because I never put them in my top 10. The couple times I do put them in my top 10, it is always a curse, so I apologize in advance. But I think Penn State deserves to be there right now. They've got their run game figured out. They've got a lot of explosiveness in the run game. Clifford is who he is. I think he's serviceable at running the offense. He can be a liability at times. But as a complement to a good run team game, he's a far more effective quarterback. You cannot run the offense through Clifford. You can use Clifford to get the offense in the right play, run it, and then complement the run game. And defensively, I feel like they're sort of turning a corner a little bit. They didn't look, they haven't looked great off and on. I don't know that they look great today. We are very much in the point where if you want to tell me why another team is top 10, feel free. There are not a lot of good options nationally. Northwestern let me be clear. Northwestern's a horrible football team, right? So when I say they weren't good today, I mean 17-7 against Northwestern and everything else looked awful. But if I'm going to keep Georgia at number 3 against a really bad Missouri team, I have a hard time dinging Penn State. And quite frankly, I don't know who the heck else to really move up because they're just really, I do feel like at least the top 10 is easier because there really aren't a whole lot of other good options in the 10 I just named. I'm curious to see if you're the same, but that's who I got.
Yeah, I'm very similar. And I didn't let y'all know earlier, but I am finishing off the rare breed. I've got the rye downstairs. I don't love it as much as the non-rye version. But yeah, Josh, I too have Ohio State number one. I think it's funny. There's Ohio State fans. I think there are Ohio State fans in the chat. While you were talking, they were complaining about Alabama's game against Texas. Alabama's game against Texas was another universe a lifetime ago. And Texas, I think, was killing West Virginia just a second ago. West Virginia's not a great team, but like Texas, having prepared for months for Alabama, having a lot of kind of inside knowledge about the program, hosting them, super hot game. Bama sputtered for a little bit. They won the game. I'm not killing Alabama for that at this point in the season.
Texas is capable of playing at a very high level.
Yeah.
And I don't know quite how to react to that Alabama game. They are, if you want to look at the overall talent, I don't think it shows up on the field most weeks, but they are like number 5 or number 6. Their ceiling compared to, if you want to talk that, like compared to the Notre Dame game, their ceiling is a lot higher than Notre Dame's, especially with their quarterbacks or with yours.
It's definitely higher than Missouri or Kent State.
We are not going to be able to evaluate that game at any point this year, and we're not going to be able to evaluate Texas at any point this year. Their problem's in consistency, not potential.
Yeah. I've got Alabama at number 2. I think what they did today was super impressive, especially with Bryce Young going down. They didn't panic when Arkansas went on their run. And Milroe held his own. I think they can win some games with him. I don't think they go undefeated this year if he's got to be the guy. But I do think they win a boatload of games. And right now, I'm just really I expect Georgia to kind of flip the switch. And this is now, like you said, 3 weeks in a row where the switch hasn't been flipped. And they did pull a late game win out against Missouri, but my goodness, that's a bad football team. So Georgia's got some issues. And I think that if their defense is that dependent on Jalen Carter and he went down, that's a concern because he's going to have to come off the field at some point. Depth, I got laughed at last week for having Tennessee number 4. I still have them at number 4. I do not like their defense, but I also think that there's warts on everybody on the rest of this list. Like everybody else they've got problems. Tennessee might lose to anybody on this list. They could beat anybody on this list. So y'all laugh at me, but when you laugh at me, post your top 10 and explain your situation. I got Michigan at number 5. I didn't love the performance today, but I also am not going to ding them for basically a 2-touchdown win on the road at Iowa. That to me, like 27 points, they got a lot of points relative to offensive production. So if you really dig into the numbers, it wasn't a great performance, but 27 points just on its face against that Iowa defense, I think is pretty respectable. Oklahoma State number 6 for me. What they did today, I think was also respectable. That game was not as close as the 11-point, final score or margin would indicate. I'm not sure that Baylor's very good this year, but they are decent defensively. So to put up 36 on them is fairly impressive. I've got Clemson at number 7. And this is interesting because I made a note earlier this week about how Leary's quarterback performance against all the teams they'd faced up to this point was the worst that any of those teams had seen all year, except for 2 games. And these teams have been playing like FCS and bad G5s, and Leary sitting up, giving 12 yards an attempt to bad G5 teams. So what did he tonight? 4.9. NC State, in my opinion, is overrated. They're not very good. I think that they're, what ECU did to South Florida today, if we're going transitive property, it's impressive, I guess, that they were able to beat them, but it's still ECU. 30-13 is that score with 3 minutes left in the fourth. Bit of a statement win, I think, for Clemson. But this is another game that if you dig into the numbers, DJU, 7 yards an attempt, 209 yards passing total. He ran it okay. Will Shipley, 4.3 yards per carry. They 4.1 overall for the team. They didn't generate, 30 points on 358 yards is wild. Like that's a lot of points for 358 yards. So I've got them where I got them at number 7, but I wouldn't be shocked if they lose 2 games this year. I've got Ole Miss at number 8, but I am also not like the more I see Ole Miss play, the more I think that they're better defensively than they've ever been in the last 3 to 5 years. But offensively, they've taken a pretty significant step back. If this defense played with the offense that Ole Miss had last year, they'd have beaten Kentucky by 3 touchdowns today. So I've got them at number 8, but it's a skeptical number 8. I know somebody in the comments said last week that we just love Ole Miss and we're always trying to put them up there. Tell me who you're putting up there besides Ole Miss. And if it's Kansas, I'm going to tell you you're crazy because, you know, I could see Kansas winning some games and maybe cracking a top 10 at some point this year. But to this point, Ole Miss has played a tougher schedule. I've got Penn State sticking at number 9. I don't love 17-7 over Northwestern. I don't love it. That gives me concern. Clifford was pedestrian today. They couldn't run it today. And that Northwestern defense is good. It's not great. It's not as good as it's been in the past. And I've got a begrudging USC moving back to my top 10 and watch them lose tonight to Arizona State just to spite me. But I, like you, Josh, don't think that defense is very good. But I also think that if you look at the teams that are other candidates to be in the top 10, Utah, maybe. Some of these other schools are just not that impressive. So that's my top 10. And like you said, I think it's Josh, tell me if this is correct. You sort of indicated this. It was easier for me to do a top 10 this week than I think any point in the year so far. Just it's going to get harder because some of these teams are going to lose. But for now, it's like we've got 10 teams that fit and then a bunch of stuff that doesn't fit in the top 10. So at least for 1 week, it's a little bit easier.
Yeah, I said that, and I agree with it. There's probably 1 or 2 more you could make an argument for, but 2 weeks ago, it felt like there were 30 teams I could have ranked top 10. And I'm sure in a couple of weeks, some of these teams are going to lose, and then they're going to get thrown back in the mix with everyone else that we're kind of right now able to sift through due to losses. And to remind everyone, our methodology is generally, if you want to think of it this way philosophically, if you took my schedule and your schedule and we traded places based off how you've done to date, how do we think you would have done with each other's schedules is always kind of the way I play it. And so when you talk a team like Kansas, if Kansas traded schedules with Kentucky, Kentucky would be undefeated. So I can't put Kansas in my top 10. And right now with these teams, they all have warts, but I can say they won all their games. So it's not hard for me to say they'd win games with somebody else's schedule because most teams to this point have like 3 garbage games in there already. They've only played a couple real games. As that number goes from 2 real games, you think 2 weeks from now, okay, well, you go from week 5 to week 7. It's like, yeah, but the next couple of weeks, we're going to double the number of meaningful games that most teams have played. And there are going to be a lot more losses as a result of that because, every time a meaningful team plays a meaningful team, someone wins and someone loses. Everybody goes 500 on average. So the number of teams with losses and warts is going to get a lot more muddled, a lot more mixed. And this has been a nice reprieve, and I know it's about to get a lot more difficult all over again.
Larry said Penn State had 4 fumbles, outgained Northwestern 220 to 35 rushing yards, 8 total turnovers, just terrible, torrential downpour weather. And yeah, look, this is everybody in the top 10 right now is in survive and advance mode because not everybody is going to do that. So given, and this is kind of a nod also to Michael, Michael's point about maybe parity is more the norm this year rather than the hype around 3 elite teams, which is why top 10 is so difficult this year. I welcome that. And yes, to me, Penn State won ugly today, but so did Georgia, literally Georgia. So right now, given where I think parity is this season, winning pretty doesn't matter as much as it has mattered in the years past. Because, Josh, there's not going to be enough people left standing with clean records for us to get to this secondary position of having to look at how bad you beat people, right?
Yeah, instead of a beauty contest this year, what you're going to end up with is a bunch of beat up, strung out teams smoking in a corner, and the 4 of them left alive are the ones.
Right.
It's more like a sort of apocalypse survival movie, than Miss Congeniality. Yeah. So yeah, like you said, survive in advance is the key to the game. But if you want to talk about the performance, again, they didn't play well. I kind of was just going to gloss over it, but you do have to remember Northwestern lost to Miami of Ohio. They lost to Southern Illinois. I mean, Northwestern is really quite bad. So, and that's like a Miami of Ohio team that was blown out by Kentucky and Cincinnati, and they just legitimately seem to be on that tier. So even in a downpour, you kind of hope with their run game that they would have just been able to even with 4 turnovers, run away with it. 30-10 at the least, right? Sort of like Georgia kind of did with Kent State, and it just never happened. So,
yeah, and that's the thing. What I want when people and look, like again, I think that Penn State winning, I didn't drop them. I kept them where I had them in the top 10. The teams ahead of them, 8 through 1, a lot of those teams are going to lose. So if Penn State still controls their own destiny, the thing I always want to say to people like Larry, who we love, friend of the show, gets at us all the time, and that's okay. I want to ask them, okay, are you given the same sort of free pass if Georgia beats a bad G5 level school in the rain? Are you giving that to Alabama? Because you're probably saying Alabama doesn't deserve to be number 2 because of what happened against Texas. So I think that that's the tough thing for a lot of fans is to say, okay, let me look at this candidly and look at it in the same through the same lens that I would a team in a conference that I hate. And I think that that's what a lot of people have a hard time doing. Stephen Light said the only good thing about Josh's Penn State pick is that this is a bye week for Penn State. We have a week to avoid the Grim Reaper. Josh, at least give them a little bit of in your family that I'm probably guessing was waiting to hear that you ranked Penn State in the top 10. Like they earned this spot, right? As much as we're giving them hell, like this isn't like a pity top 10. Like they legitimately earn their spot in your top 10.
yeah, I mean, they're a defense-driven team that focuses really on the run game on offense, and they're a solid football team right now. They're playing solid football, at least as much as anyone else is. They earned their spot in the top 10. There's a reason they haven't been on the top 10 to date. There's a reason I'm still a little skeptical and have them down at 10, but they earned that spot. And to your point, Daniel, the problem everybody runs into at this level is when you want to be in the top 10, these games against a Missouri or an Auburn or what have you, that where you're struggling a little bit, start to become a big deal. Beating Northwestern by 10 points is not great, even despite weather conditions. And I get it's severe weather conditions, but that was, again, very bad Northwestern team. So all that stuff. Well, I will give a little bit of a pass too in the fact that Northwestern's problems have a lot to do with athleticism, and severe weather does negate that. So, maybe there's more of an argument that I'm giving credit for. So yeah, they're in my top 10. So I'm not being that critical, right? I do think they're a very good football team.
Killtag9 says, how do y'all make determinations on who is a better between the SEC teams and Big Ten teams, specifically Ohio State being ranked number 1 when history, the Big Ten has been the worst conference to show up in the playoffs? Look, I don't care what they've done in the past. I mean, I don't. I'm more concerned, Josh, with the fact that Maryland and I think Indiana and Michigan and maybe 1 or 2 more Big Ten teams aren't playing Power 5 teams this year. Like I'm more concerned with that than anything they've done in the past in the playoffs. Because look, Ohio State's been blanked in the playoffs by Clemson. And what did they do the last time they played Clemson? They beat that ass. So history doesn't mean as much to me as kind of what we're seeing this year. And I will say right now, I'm saying the Big Ten is the second best conference. And look, like LSU beat Auburn today. It was a struggle. It wasn't a struggle for Penn State. So that is something they get credit for. But really, I'm just trying to, at this point, it's a guess. And Josh, I feel like you're the same way. I'm just trying to see what I see on Saturdays and make a guess, because at this point, given the parity, it's really hard to know who the best conference is.
It is. It is. And we tend to just sort of adjust everything based on our assumptions. Illinois blowing out Wisconsin really ought to recalibrate the way you think about a lot of things. It's tough to really figure out what that means and what it means for the Big Ten. It's easy to say, past history means blah, 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 blah. But I'm the biggest one to say, look, just because you lost last year doesn't mean you're going to lose this year. Just because you lost last week doesn't mean you're going to lose this week in a lot of ways. So don't take it all for granted. But when you start looking down that roster of Big Ten teams, just like the SEC, I feel like they don't have the same depth of quality teams. I feel like there is, again, normally there's a first tier, a second tier, and a third tier. That second tier just doesn't exist. It's all in the third tier, and then evaluating that tier is hard as heck. So it is eye test. The lack of out of conference games that are meaningful forces us to do eye test. If you beat another team in your own conference, how in the world am I supposed to evaluate that versus another conference, right? Like it's like, as I always say, it's like holding up a Polaroid of the Himalayas and a Polaroid of the Alps. And well, in this Alps picture, this Alp is a lot taller than this other Alp. And these two Himalayas mountains look really the same. So I guess that really tall mountain over here is the tallest one. That from an analytic statistical perspective, that really is essentially what's happening. So it's hard. It's really, really hard. We have to nitpick a lot. A lot of it is our own interpretation, watching them, of what it looks like they're playing, how well they move around, what they're doing, how they execute. It's a lot of subjective eye test for us at this point. Will be all year. And I will be honest, anyone that says they can really model how the Big Ten compares to the SEC, they're wrong. You can't. The only way you can really do it is when can I go on a little bit of a mini rant, Daniel, please?
Sure, do it.
The only way you can do that is by using priors. And I got this long Twitter conversation with a lot of people. I had a lot of angry comments back and forth, and there was a whole thing. People never understood the point I was trying to drive home, I think, or several people didn't, that were being really critical of it.
Bill Connolly.
Yeah. It was a little bit of a come in, take a punch, and get out. But that's a whole other conversation. I was saying that we don't use priors, and I was saying that priors have a lot of disadvantages. People took that as me saying I never use priors and you shouldn't use priors. Not the point. The point is, what priors will tell you is a team that was good last year tends to be good the next year. A team that recruits at a very high level tends to reflect that recruiting. And so if you use those, on average, it's going to make you more accurate, because the reason for that is there's a lot of stuff models don't tell you. They do not tell you between the Big Ten and the SEC which one's better. When they're siloed, when they don't have games against each other and they're not connected, math can't look at the Big Ten and look at the SEC that don't play each other and have any magic way of knowing which one's better. It may see these 8 teams in the Big Ten play better on average than these 8 teams in the SEC, but what it can't say is these teams play better because the rest of the conference is worse, and so their stats are inflated. That's how stats work, and there's no way for a model to do it. So the only way to improve that, really the only thing you have available to you, is looking at what happened last year, especially like bowl games, to sort of give yourself some stability and a baseline, especially early in the year. And then recruiting gets injected as a proxy. So most quality betting metrics, if you want to bet on a model, use recruiting as a variable, particularly in out of conference, because it's important for you. The only way for you to really know, okay, when these teams are siloed, right? Even within the SEC to this point, you have groups of teams like Florida and Kentucky that play each other, or Arkansas and South Carolina that they haven't played the rest of the conference. This silo is probably not as good as this silo. Why do I know that? Because this other silo was better last year and they recruit better. And that's why those things make your numbers better. But what they can't, there's this give and take. The more they do that, the more they just kind of tell you what you already know or you think you know. And the less the model is really telling you, okay, yeah, this team was really good last year, but they're not good this year. Maybe they've taken a step back. Maybe they start out the year kind of weak and they take a turn. Notre Dame was a big one. They were top 20 in a lot of major metrics because those metrics use priors. Cincinnati was top 20 in a lot of major metrics because they use priors. They have not looked good this year. And it takes a long time for the model to say, okay, they've looked so bad, I need to start to discard the priors. none of these systems are perfect is the point. I would never bet on a model. I'm going to bet on myself and how I look at teams, and I'm going to use the model to inform me, okay, what are the priors like for these teams? How should I factor that in? And our model doesn't use priors because I really just want to know this year how they've been playing. Do they meet the expectations I have in my head? Because I know what recruiting's like. I follow it pretty closely. I know what they did last year. I can look up the results, and I watch football pretty closely. And so that's what I use a model for, is sort of trying to make sure that I don't have my own ingrown biases where I'm ignoring some sort of trend or change. And if the data is junk in the model, it's junk in the model, and I'm not going to use it. So that's my mini rant on it. That's sort of my view on priors and a lot of data usage. And the biggest thing that frustrates me more than anything in this world is when people have a model or a metric or a stat or a number, and they act like that thing really tells you the result, or that it's totally determinative, or it's the single and only best way to do it. Because it's a game with a funny shaped football with a lot of really weird variables that come into play. And there's just no real way to take the real world reality of football and put it into numbers. All we can do is approximate certain things. We can quantify certain trends, but it's always a very rough, fuzzy estimate. It's always going to be wrong in a lot of ways. And the more people go down that rabbit hole, I think sometimes we go too far in trying to act like analytics can give us an answer that it just doesn't. And given the little amount of data that you have, let me be honest, it never, ever will.
And with that, we'll see. We got about 3 more minutes left. Bruce Rivers says, I'm glad we get to talk college football with you guys. I got Bama, OSU, Georgia, Clemson, and Michigan in that order. Go Bucks, Buckeye Nation. And look, I think that there's a lot of Michigan fans that are frustrated. And somebody even said put Clemson over Georgia. I think the problem is, maybe Georgia Tech is better than we think, since they're going to beat Pitt, looks like, and Clemson murdered them. But I feel like there's still this thing with Clemson that their offense is improved, but it's not great, and their defense is taking a step back from where it's been in the recent past, which tells me it's good enough to beat the teams they played so far. But if they played Michigan, if they played, Ohio State, that's a different level of discussion. Josh, you're talking about how we judge, and we really do have to go. We got a few minutes left. I kind of want to, maybe we can end on this. It's hard to judge SEC to Big Ten, but let's talk just Big Ten. How do we judge right now Michigan versus Ohio State? We don't have to, because they'll play eventually. But if we're looking at these two teams and we just want to, sort of accommodate the trash talk that's going on in the chat right now, how do we compare those two teams at this point?
Yeah, and I know there's a few super chats, and watch as I work them in, because I think it actually fits in the answer. You've got to be subjective about where they're playing, and use your eyes and talk about how they look and talk about the way they flow around the field. To my eyes, Ohio State looks a lot more athletic than Michigan. They look like they fly around the ball better. The quarterback play. See, people, I think, are a little too quick with any quarterback to say, well, he's just having a bit of an off day. CJ Stroud is always a little bit off and on. He always has been. He kind of, when he's in rhythm, he's great. And then he's often not in rhythm. And at some point, that's just kind of who he is. But I think it shows where his ceiling is tangibly, but it also is a little bit from him as a passer and setting his base and everything else, which is every quarterback's problem. But developmentally, I feel like he's way ahead of J.J. McCarthy. From a skill position perspective, I think Ohio State's way ahead of Michigan. From a talent perspective on defense, I feel like they're probably ahead of Michigan. I feel like they're a better team. And people throw up stats like they throw up McCarthy stats. And Michael Baumert asked, do you adjust your model to exclude garbage time stats where both teams put in second string players? I will say our model does to a small degree, not as much as we want, because we haven't had enough finite or granular data to do that the way we wanted to do. Long version, story short, we're actually kind of working on that.
Yep,
yeah, we're working on it a little bit. But we're trying to get there. But that's a good example, because McCarthy's statistics, we noted this in the chat earlier, He put up crazy numbers on Hawaii and UConn. Those are two of the worst, probably 30 football teams that have been fielded in like 5 years. It's easy to have those kind of numbers on Hawaii and UConn. And I don't care if it's garbage time or non-garbage time. It's easy to have those numbers. It doesn't tell me anything. I cared more about how he got the numbers. And that's where I'm saying, yeah, he made this great play where he scrambled and hit a guy deep, but he really should have hit the hot read right here, right now. Same comments I had about Anthony Richardson early last year. There were phenomenal plays to get it. It's like FAU where he ran around the edge for like 80 yards. I said, yeah, but he ran around the edge because he didn't see a blitzing corner in a cat blitz. His receiver was wide open immediately. And rather than throwing it, he didn't see him, realized he was coming, spun at the rest second, dodged a tackle, and went all the way around. That looks great against FAU, but against a real team, that's actually a sack where it should have been a good play. And so that you have to use that kind of eye test. And I will say Michigan has some big pieces. So here, last two super chats. Nick said, what do you think about Blake Corum to move forward to be considered as a Heisman finalist? 30 carries a game won't cut it. I think it's funny if you're saying 30 carries a game as a running back won't cut it. That's actually a lot. I think Corum is a really, really good player, but he's a piece that does certain things well. He is a dynamic running back. There are a lot of those out there, but I think he's a particularly dynamic running back. He's not built to run 30 to 40 times a game. He's not that big. He's not that physical. He is big and physical enough to play running back and to play at a high level, but he's not Derrick Henry, okay? And so he doesn't need to be taking that kind of step forward. And the other comment Nick made was that Michigan potentially found something with Mike Morris on the left edge and a Yabioki on the edge. True or false? This is where it gets really tough because and I'm going to punt this answer, sorry, but this is where, competition starts to really, really matter, because whether or not somebody is really, really good at the edge or at the line of scrimmage depends a lot upon the other team. Iowa hasn't been able to block all year. Did you find something? Or is Iowa just really bad on the offensive line? Is their scheme really basic? Are they really predictable when you rush the passer? I don't know. And one of the worst things that happens in college football is that we have these games and then we can't really draw a conclusion because we don't know if it's a result of your opponent and how you played. And so we don't draw any conclusion. I think Michigan has put some things together. I do think they found some pieces that work better. I think the opponents matter a little bit too. And really, I just feel robbed of an opportunity to make a proper evaluation because of Michigan's schedule. And I wish they played a tougher schedule because I'd have a better idea of them. But as it is, it's going to take me a number of games to really get up to speed.
And that's how you get all the super chats in right before you go to bed. And look, I think you're right. Like on Blake Corum, I think he's a good back. I think that they need a really good second back to step up because they had that last year down the stretch, and that really made a difference. And I think we're seeing this. A lot of people are talking about Alabama right now. I think we're seeing this with Alabama. They have something in their running back room that they didn't have last year. They're having to rely so much on Brian Robinson because everybody was hurt. But today, Jason McClellan has been that guy a little bit, at least between the tackles. And they've been using Gibbs a lot, split out or, catching the ball out of the backfield. And Jason McClellan got hurt and Gibbs just came out and went off, and they didn't have that last year. So I think that you need a couple of running backs. That's where I'm a little bit worried about Georgia too, because I don't love what I'm seeing from the running back room this year. Josh, I know we got to go. I want to end this. I think this is a good one to end on. This is we're talking about Alabama. Mucho Mongo said, "How does it feel? I'll put it up on the screen. How does it feel seeing the initial model be that good compared to how Bama started?" And we talked about this because I went back and looked, and I noted, Josh, that Arkansas had 0 garbage time drives, just for kind of what you talked about earlier. We're working on the model a little bit. We're actually working on data to where we can automate it, which we can automate out a lot of the garbage time, information that'll make it more accurate. I noted on Arkansas's data, they had 0 garbage time drives this year in spite of playing 2 G5s and an FCS. That's a cause for concern when they're playing Alabama. And you and I both said with a 51-12 model score, I don't think it's that outrageous. Everybody in the comments, because we both picked a blowout. We both picked Bama to cover comfortably. Everybody in the comments is like, burn your model's dumb, 51-12, that's silly. But Josh, if Bryce Young's healthy today, I don't know if the model's wrong. Let's end on that.
Yeah, I think Alabama would have won something like 50-13. They really would have. And I will be completely honest, that a lot of that was where Alabama is, where they're going, where they're at offensively. Again, the run game being undervalued. A lot of it was the fact that people didn't appreciate that Arkansas's defense, even now, with as impressive as Alabama is, I think Arkansas's defense is really bad. I think they're quite bad. And I think the most impressive part of that game, people took away Alabama's offense and putting it away. Would you agree with me, Daniel, on this? It was really that Alabama's defense, despite everything that was going on and being on the field a ton, held firm and kept that game to below 30 from Arkansas, because Arkansas has a pretty darn good offense and they've got explosiveness, and they never, outside one part where they actually had some injuries and they're on the field a ton, they never really gave up a lot. And to me, that was almost more impressive than the offense. But because I think people's perceptions are out of whack with Arkansas, at least personally, I don't think people took away what they probably should have.
Yeah, I think that game, because Bryce Young got hurt and Milroe came in and then Gibbs ran for 200 and something yards, it buried the lead because the defense was the story for almost 2 quarters of that game, which allowed Alabama to get out to a 28-0 lead. They were pitching a shutout, 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out against a good offense. Not a great offense, but a good offense. And I think that Alabama fans, they'll never be happy because they're miserable like that. Pete Golding has fielded now 2020. By the end of the year, that defense was elite. 21, that defense was excellent. And now in 22, a really good defense. And I don't think he's getting his due because I think they probably have the best defense in the country.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty true.
All right. Michael, with a quick super chat before we go, he said, can y'all do a show about how well the model works over time? Love what you do. We can probably put something together or maybe comment on the model and how it gets better throughout the year. We did do a full breakdown on how the model works if you're interested on how we do that from a yards per play perspective and how we, work our data in. So it's out there on our channel. If you just search our videos, we did a video exactly on the model itself. I'm trying to get Josh to stop explaining the model every preview we do, because I noted in my mind when I cut up the podcast this week, if you listen to our podcast for the previews, we did 3 previews. You got 3 explanations of how the model works. So I'm gonna give Josh hell about that tomorrow if he tries to do it again. But y'all, thanks so much for hanging with us for this long. It didn't go as long as normal. We're trying to get these done a little quicker so Josh can get to bed. And then we can get up tomorrow and record some previews for y'all to listen to throughout the week. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week and God bless.